Welcome to Voice of the Voiceless. This is your host speaking, Emily. Today's podcast is on formula feeding and making formula feeding safe. So our guest today is Maureen Minchin. Maureen Minchin is a medical historian and health educator. So since the 1970s, when she had her children, she went on a life-changing journey to provide advice and support to families experiencing allergies, and also to educate health practitioners and in this area. So she's been involved in global health efforts to promote evidence-based infant feeding. She's been doing this for decades. She's a consultant to the World Health Organization and the United Nations Children's Fund. And she's also a founding member of the World Alliance for Breastfeeding Action Research Task Force. So Maureen has written a few books, one of which is called Milk Matters, Infant Feeding and Immune Disorder. So she references this book a little bit in this podcast. So that's what the book is named if you're interested and you want to go and have a look and have a read of it. So this podcast is really about providing the information and the facts about formula feeding, about different brands of formula and about the formula industry. Maureen gives advice about how to make formula feeding as safe as possible. So it's really just to give those facts so that for a parent listening, they can make an informed choice about formula feeding and how they choose to feed the baby, if they're fully formula feeding or if they're mixed feeding. So that's what this is about. And if you're a parent who's also thinking of breastfeeding or who's mixed feeding, I've done some podcasts if you haven't listened to about breastfeeding, so I would recommend listening to that. So that was with Maureen as well. Maureen is very knowledgeable in infant feeding and has been in this area for decades. So she is a really, really good resource, and I'm really grateful for her being able to speak to us and give us all this information, and hopefully this will benefit a lot of people listening. So we recorded this over Zoom as Maureen and I live in different states and it wasn't possible to meet. So I will put on that recording now. Hope you enjoy. Hi Maureen, welcome to Voice of the Voiceless.
Thank you, Emily.
Would you like to introduce yourself?
I guess so. People can always look me up via my website or Facebook page or whatever and find out. But basically, I'm someone who got interested in infant feeding because I was feeding infants and it wasn't a very happy experience to start with. And I discovered a great deal that I didn't know in that process. I've been teaching health professionals ever since and writing, and the books that I've written have been hailed as groundbreaking on every occasion. The first of them was about food intolerance in children. The second was called Breastfeeding Matters, about clinical issues of who was responsible for why women weren't breastfeeding. The third, Milk Matters, is about infant feeding and immune disorder, looking at the issues of the science and the history of infant formula. There's a huge amount in there. It really is a book more about formula feeding than anything else. But then it has a section on crying babies, what to do about miserable babies, basically. So it's a substantial book, which is available as 2 ebooks because the hardback is 800 plus pages and not very easy to read one-handed while you're feeding a baby, whereas the digital versions are a lot simpler to get through. So that's me, and I've worked for international organisations and done all sorts of interesting things along the way, and still am doing so. I've just come back from a consultation on the marketing of infant formula in Frankfurt in November, and various odds and ends, one way or another. So formula feeding is something I've been concerned about for a very long time, and I was probably the first person to go into print on that subject as early as the 1980s, looking at some of the ways that we could try and make formula feeding safer.
Yep. So why do we need a program on this topic in a country like Australia?
Because babies have the same needs everywhere in the world, and because formula feeding is as dangerous everywhere in the world, it is more dangerous in countries where the water supply is contaminated or unreliable, and where it's more dangerous wherever poverty exists. The mothers who are likely to be listening to this are likely to be advantaged mothers who will assume that there aren't any risks to feeding infant formula. But in actual fact, as WHO keeps highlighting, it is an unsterile product, and so it needs to be treated with a great deal of respect in order to minimise the harms that can be associated with it. Perhaps we should say before we begin that this is not a program that will disrespect the formula feeding mother. There are many reasons why mothers are formula feeding. I've used formula myself for my children, and while my grandchildren haven't needed to use it and probably won't, it's one of those things that I know better than just about anybody on the planet. I think that the reasons why women formula feed are complex, and most of them are beyond their control, so that to talk about the choice of formula feeding is sometimes a rather sad joke. Women often have no choice but to formula feed, and for that reason formula needs to be as good as it can be, and its preparation and use need to be as safe as they can be, because it is intrinsically a risky product. And while that's a scary thought, you're better to know it and to treat it with great respect than to assume that it's safe and be casual about how you use it.
Can you tell us a little bit about what a parent who chooses to formula feed or in another circumstance may not even have that choice, what would they need to know about a particular brand or a product?
This is one of the areas where you would think that when we can get comparisons of washing machines and all sorts of other things to guide our choices of important purchases, you would think that there would be a great body of comparative literature out there that would enable us to, with some confidence, tell people what was a better product than another product. But comparative studies between formula brands are almost non-existent. In actual fact, what we do know is that formulas are made to regulatory standards which vary around the world. Australia has some quite good regulatory standards, but the policing of those standards is a lot less clear in real terms. To date in Australia, the only time that breaches of the standards have been reported have been when one competitor has dobbed in another, rather than when independent studies have been done, comparative studies that point up some difficulty or other. The regulations are good, and the major brands will almost certainly be conforming to them, but the regulations are not precise. Many people sort of see regulations as specifying recipes. That's just not possible with infant formula. They are ranges, and the brands are all different. People will say, oh, they're all the same. They're not all the same. There are differences between brands, but unfortunately we can't use that to guide us, because nobody does the research to tell you what the outcome differences are between brands. I think that's a long overdue pieces of research that need to be constantly done, because every change that's made to a formula may change its outcome. They're very complex, and the baby is very complex, and allowing for outcomes, knowing what the outcomes are, is something that we haven't done to this date. So what can we say that's helpful? Well, if you're buying an infant formula, buy one that says that it's a first formula suitable from birth to 12 months. don't swap over to follow-on formulas, and I'll come to the reasons for that. But if you're going to use that formula for 12 months if you can find one that the child tolerates. It's quite usual for you to need to try a few before you settle on one that the baby seems to like. But within that framework of first infant formula, choose the ones that have the lowest protein content. When you look for protein content, look and see how much per 100 mils of protein there are. Never get anything with more than 14 grams 100 mils, 14 grams a litre, that's 1.4 per 100 mils. And preferably one that specifies less would be useful as well. This is because the companies are recognising that the excess protein in infant formula has been responsible in many ways for the obesity epidemic that we're seeing, that too much protein actually programs the baby for obesity lifelong, which is not something any of us really want to see happening. So lowest protein, first formula, and I would say reputable manufacturer. One of the big brands I would suggest rather than a smaller one. The smaller ones simply don't have the expertise of 150 years of having made changes after realising mistakes in their formulations. So I personally would go for something. I'd also then look at country of origin to see where they're produced. Not that that means that the ingredients come from that country of origin. Nearly all of them are produced from ingredients that come from multiple different countries. But Europe has higher standards than does, say, South Africa, perhaps, where some of the formulas are now being made. We've got to look at the issues of after that, you might think about the issues of food miles and all the other concerns that people have in relation to formula. But fundamentally, get the best brand you can for the first formula, lowest protein content within that framework. And after that, just be prepared to try that one, see how it goes. If you can get sample sachets of these things, it does save you a bit of money. If you find that a child doesn't tolerate one formula, you can try a smaller version. Sorry. Basically, lowest protein, think about country of origin, think about the history of the product. I don't have any specific brands that I would recommend. I do think that quite possibly the European standards might mean that there is a little more care there, but that's entirely subjective. So I can't really say to you which one will work best for your baby, because your baby is unique, and you'll only find out through trial and error what things work for that particular child. If don't go with I was formula fed brand X and therefore that's what I'll choose for my baby. That's simply, basically you've got no real way of knowing that brand X when you were fed is the same thing as brand X now. You can start there if you like, but do know that they will be different products, because formula is constantly changing as companies recognise problems and add things to it or subtract things from it or reduce things in it as time goes on.
So after parents have decided on what brand of formula to go with, and after they bought it, how can they decrease the risk of contamination?
Well, first of all, they need to realise no powdered infant formula is sterile. They all contain microbes of some sort, because you can't produce a powdered formula in a germ-free environment. It's simply not possible. So take it for granted that you're dealing with a product that potentially has pathogens in it. It may not, but mold spores are always in the air, and there are bacteria that have been very closely associated with infant formula and caused problems. So basically assume that it's not a sterile product and treat it very carefully that way. Don't blame yourself if subsequently